The lecture hall at Princeton University fell silent as Professor Richard Harmon's chalk screeched across the blackboard. The sound, like fingernails on a chalkboard, made several students wince, but no one dared to react visibly. Not in Harmon's advanced multivariable calculus class, not when he was in one of his moods. "And this," he said, underlining a complex equation with a heavy stroke, "is the foundation of everything we'll be covering this semester." He turned to face the class, steel-gray eyes scanning the sea of faces. "If you can't grasp this, you might as well drop the class now." The threat hung in the air. This was why they called him Heartless Harmon, a brilliant mathematician who seemed to take pleasure in thinning his class roster by the midterm. His trimmed beard and tailored blazers gave him the appearance of academic royalty, and he carried himself as though mathematics was a kingdom where he alone held the crown. In the third row, Zora Jackson sat with perfect posture, her dark fingers tapping silently against her notebook. At 19, she was younger than most juniors, having skipped 2 grades in elementary school. She'd learned early that being both black and brilliant meant constantly proving herself in spaces that weren't designed for her. "Now," Harmon continued, chalk poised against the board, "who can tell me where the critical points would be in this function?" Silence. The kind of heavy silence that made students suddenly find their shoelaces fascinating. No one. His disappointment was theatrical. How disappointing. And here I thought Princeton admitted the best and brightest. Zora's hand rose slowly, deliberately. Harmon's eyes narrowed slightly when he saw her. She'd noticed this before. The subtle shift in his demeanor whenever she participated, as if her presence in his advanced class was an anomaly he couldn't quite reconcile. "Miss Jackson." Her name sounded like a challenge from his lips. "Enlighten us." Zora cleared her throat, her voice steady. "There would be critical points at x equals pi over 4 and 3pi over 4. Harmon's eyebrow arched. "And how did you arrive at that conclusion?" "By taking the derivative and setting it equal to 0, she answered simply. Something flickered across his face. Irritation, perhaps, or surprise. He hadn't expected her to know. That much was clear. But instead of acknowledging her correct answer, he pivoted. "That's the mechanical approach," he said dismissively. "Anyone can memorize steps. The question is whether you understand the underlying theory." Zora felt the familiar weight settle on her shoulders. The burden of constantly having to prove herself, to demonstrate that she belonged in spaces where people like her were historically excluded. She'd faced it since elementary school, when her 3rd-grade teacher had accused her of cheating on a math test because no one could solve these problems that quickly. "I do understand the theory, Professor," she said evenly. Harmon's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then perhaps you could come to the board and explain it to the class." Whispers rippled through the lecture hall. Everyone knew what this meant. Harmon was setting her up to fail, a public demonstration to reinforce his authority and her supposed limitations. Zora stood, smoothing her jeans and adjusting her Princeton sweatshirt. She walked to the front with measured steps, conscious of 60 pairs of eyes following her movement. The weight of the chalk in her hand was familiar, a tool she'd mastered long before most kids had graduated from crayons. "Whenever you're ready, Miss Jackson," Harmon said, leaning against his desk, arms crossed. The stance of someone settling in to watch a car crash, but Zora wasn't going to crash. She faced the board and began to write, her handwriting flowing. With the confidence of someone who saw mathematics not as a subject to be feared, but as a language she'd been fluent in since childhood. "The function exhibits critical points at these values," she explained, her chalk making precise marks on the board, "because at these points, the derivative equals 0, indicating either a maximum, minimum, or inflection point." Her explanation continued, clear and methodical, building on concepts they'd covered and extending into connections Harmon hadn't yet made in class. Behind her, the whispers died down. The lecture hall had gone completely silent, but not from fear, from attention. Zora turned back to face the class, meeting Harmon's gaze directly. His expression was rigid, jaw clenched slightly. This wasn't going according to his script. She had not only answered correctly, but had demonstrated a depth of understanding that challenged his authority. "That's one approach," he said finally, his voice tight. "Though I'd question whether—" "Excuse me, Professor," Zora interrupted, something she'd never done before. "But there's an inconsistency in the original equation." The class collectively held its breath. No one interrupted Harmon. No one questioned his mathematics. His eyes narrowed. "I beg your pardon?" Zora pointed to the board. "The second coefficient should be negative, not positive. Otherwise, the function wouldn't behave as described in the problem statement." Harmon's face flushed. He took a step forward, scanning the equation with critical eyes. For an excruciating moment, no one moved. Then his shoulders tensed, a subtle admission she was right. "A deliberate error," he said smoothly, to see if anyone was paying attention. Several students exchanged glances. No one believed him. "You may sit down, Miss Jackson." Zora returned to her seat, heart hammering but expression neutral. She'd won this round, but she knew the battle was just beginning. Harmon wasn't a man who took challenges to his authority lightly. Sure enough, as she slid into her chair, he called out, "Since you seem so confident in your abilities, perhaps you could tackle something more substantial." He turned to the board, erasing her work with quick, aggressive strokes, and began writing a new problem, one that sprawled across the entire board, filled with complex integrations and obscure theorems. The class recognized it immediately. It was similar to problems reserved for graduate-level qualifying exams, far beyond what an undergraduate should be expected to solve. "Take your time," Harmon said, his smile sharp. "We'll wait." Kayla Henderson, Zora's roommate, shot her a concerned look from across the aisle. This wasn't just a challenge, it was academic hazing. But Zora merely nodded, rising once more. This wasn't the first time a teacher had tried to break her spirit by raising the bar impossibly high. Her mother, a high school physics teacher, had warned her, "They'll set different standards for you. Meet them, then set your own goals." She approached the board again, studying the problem for a moment. It was challenging, yes, but not impossible. Not for her. Numbers had always been her sanctuary, a place where truth was absolute, where 2 + 2 always equal 4, regardless of who was doing the calculation. Zora began to write, her movements fluid, confident. The chalk clicked against the board in a steady rhythm as she worked through the problem step by step. There was a beauty to mathematics that transcended the sterile classroom environment, an elegant logic that had captivated her since she was a child, counting stars from her bedroom window. The minutes ticked by. No one spoke. Even Harmon seemed transfixed as she filled the board with precise calculations, never hesitating, never backtracking. When she finally placed the final stroke, underlining her answer twice, the silence in the room had shifted quality. It was no longer tense. It was awed. Zora turned, placing the chalk back on the narrow tray. "The answer is negative infinity, converging from the right." Harmon stared at the board, then at her, then back at the board. His expression was unreadable. He couldn't claim this was wrong. Every step was meticulously executed, the logic flawless. But he also couldn't concede that an undergraduate student, particularly one he had clearly underestimated, had solved a graduate-level problem without preparation. "Interesting approach," he said finally, his tone carefully measured. "Though, there are more elegant solutions." "Actually," a voice spoke from the back of the lecture hall, "that's the most elegant solution I've seen to this particular problem." All heads turned. Dr. Elaine Chen, chair of the mathematics department, stood in the doorway. No one had noticed her enter, captivated as they were by Zora's demonstration. "Dr. Chen," Harmon said, clearly surprised. "I didn't realize you were observing today." "Clearly," she replied, walking down the center aisle. She stopped beside Zora, studying the board. "Miss Jackson, is it? That's impressive work." "Thank you, Dr. Chen," Zora said quietly. "I'd be interested to discuss your approach further, perhaps during my office hours this week." Zora nodded, aware that Harmon was watching this exchange with thinly veiled irritation. Being singled out for praise by the department chair was both an honor and a complication. "Well," Harmon said, clapping his hands once, "let's continue with the scheduled material." But something had shifted in the classroom dynamic. As Zora returned to her seat, she felt the eyes of her classmates, no longer dismissive, now curious and respectful. Harmon's authority had been challenged not by defiance, but by excellence. The rest of the lecture proceeded without incident, though Harmon noticeably avoided calling on Zora again. When class ended, students lingered, several, approaching Zora with questions and comments. "That was incredible," said Jason, a sophomore who usually sat in the back. "How did you solve it so quickly?" Before she could answer, Kayla appeared at her side, looping an arm through hers. "My roommate's a genius, that's how," she said with a proud grin. "And some people are just now figuring that out." As they packed up their things, Harmon approached, his expression carefully composed. "Miss Jackson, a word." Kayla squeezed her arm before stepping away, giving Harmon a cool look as she left. "Yes, Professor," Zora said, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. "That was impressive work today," he said, the words seemingly difficult for him to form. "Though I would caution against interrupting in the future." "I'll keep that in mind," she replied evenly. He hesitated, then added, "There's a mathematics competition next month. The Princeton team could use someone with your aptitude." It wasn't quite an apology, nor was it the acknowledgement she deserved. But it was a movement in the right direction. "I'll think about it," Zora said. As she walked out of the lecture hall, she felt lighter somehow. The burden hadn't disappeared. She knew there would be more professors like Harmon, more moments where she'd have to prove herself. But today, she'd turned a challenge into an opportunity, transformed a potential humiliation into recognition. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, the campus vibrant with fall colors. Kayla was waiting, alongside their friend Eli, who had heard about the incident through the efficient Princeton gossip network. "So," Eli said, falling into step beside her, "I hear you absolutely destroyed heartless Harmon today. Please tell me if someone recorded it." Zora laughed, the sound carrying across the courtyard. "It wasn't about destroying anyone. It was about standing my ground." "Well, whatever it was," Kayla said, "it's already legendary. Tyler from my biology class texted me about it, and he wasn't even there." News traveled fast at Princeton, especially news that involved the toppling of established hierarchies. By dinner, Zora had received emails from 3 professors, including Dr. Chen, and an invitation to join the university's prestigious mathematics research program, an opportunity usually reserved for seniors and graduate students. That evening, as she worked on problem sets in the library, her phone pinged with a text from her mother. "How was your day, brilliant girl?" Zora smiled, typing back, "It was challenging, but I was ready." The following week, Zora entered Harmon's class to find him writing a new equation on the board. When he turned and saw her, there was a flicker of something, not quite respect, but acknowledgement. "Miss Jackson," he said with a slight nod. "Professor Harmon," she replied, taking her seat. The lesson proceeded normally, but when Harmon posed a particularly tricky question to the class, his eyes found hers deliberately. "Anyone care to tackle this?" Several hands went up, including Zora's. Princeton students were never shy about demonstrating their knowledge. But what was different was Harmon's response. "Let's hear from Mr. Davis first, then Miss Jackson." It was a small adjustment, but significant. He was no longer singling her out to fail. He was acknowledging her as one of many capable students. In his class, after class, Dr. Chen was waiting in the hallway. "Have you considered my offer to join the research program?" she asked as they walked together. I have, Zora replied. I'd like to accept. Dr. Chen smiled. Excellent. And the mathematics competition? Professor Harmon mentioned he'd invited you to join the team. Zora hesitated. Working with Harmon would be challenging, given their history, but it was also an opportunity to continue breaking barriers, to show that she belonged not just in the classroom, but in competitive spaces as well. I'll do it, she decided. Wonderful. Between you and me, Dr. Chen said, lowering her voice, the department could use more students like you. Brilliant minds who aren't afraid to stand their ground. As they parted ways, Zora caught sight of Harmon in his office, bent over papers. He glanced up, meeting her eyes through the glass. Neither smiled, but there was a mutual recognition of talent, of challenge, of the unspoken conversations that happen in academic spaces when established power dynamics are disrupted. Zora continued down the hall, her footsteps confident. Today was just one day, one class, one small victory in what would be a lifetime of proving herself. But each time she did, the path became a little clearer, not just for her, but for those who would follow, because mathematics didn't care about the color of your skin or the assumptions people made about you. Numbers were pure, unbiased. And in a world full of prejudice and preconception, Zora had found her universal language, one that spoke truth regardless of who was listening. The next day, a freshman approached her after class. I heard what happened, she said shyly. I'm also majoring in math and, well, it's nice to see someone who looks like me succeeding here. Zora smiled, remembering her own search for role models when she'd first arrived at Princeton. What's your name? Aisha. Well, Aisha, if you ever need help with calculus or dealing with professors who underestimate you, my door is always open. As they walked together across the quad, Zora realized that this was perhaps the most important equation she'd solve at Princeton. How to transform obstacles into opportunities, prejudice into platforms for excellence. It wasn't a solution she'd find in any textbook, but it was one she was determined to master. In Professor Harmon's class and beyond, she would continue to raise her hand, to approach the board, to solve the problems that others deemed impossible. Not just because she could, but because each time she did, she rewrote the formula for who belonged in these hallowed halls of academia.